our third interview now. And just to remind you, our theme for the programme is end-of-life planning. So we're very pleased to have in the studio with us today Susan Walker. Hello and welcome, Susan.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Hello. Now, Susan is a humanist celebrant for funerals, and in fact she's the vice chair of the North East Humanists, and I believe also a member of the Natural Death Society. So Susan, perhaps we can start with, what is humanism?
Okay, humanism is a life view where humanists don't believe in a god. We don't tend to believe in anything supernatural. We believe we have one life and we need to live that one life to the best of our ability. I think that's the very short answer of humanism. I could go on for some time, I won't.
Well, maybe we'll pick up some of those things as we go along. But okay, so what is a humanist ceremony? I mean, as opposed to a religious ceremony.
As humanists, we want to commemorate or mark important stages in our life, like birth, marriage, and today we're talking especially about death. We want to mark those occasions because we're human beings. But we don't necessarily have any supernatural being we want to give thanks to. Instead, we want to share our memories. Talking about badges, legacy. It was very touching because although that's a very simplistic way, that's a lot of what goes on in a humanist ceremony for a funeral, is we look at the ways that somebody has touched our lives, their memories, their legacy, and how they've changed us, and we celebrate that. And that's in a humanist funeral, but it's always, we just look for ways of celebrating those different points in our life and marking them.
Is it more like I'm thinking of the Irish wake, where people come together and share their stories. Is it like, would you describe a humanist ceremony as maybe a formal wake?
I hadn't thought of it like that, but yes, in a way it is, because what happens before the ceremony, I go out to the family's house, and the family, quite often there's several members of the family there, and they're all sharing their stories and chipping in and sharing their remembrances, and I'm taking those all together and collating them, and then I'm sharing them with the wider community who knew the person, and sharing those stories. And then they will go on afterwards normally and continue sharing those stories and other stories and adding to them. So yeah, I think I quite like that idea. I hadn't thought of it like that, but I do like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. You say you go out and speak to them beforehand. You know, how long would that conversation be? You know, I'm just trying to picture myself. If someone close to me had died, I ring you up. How do I get in contact with you?
If it's someone's close to you died, normally it would be the funeral director who would get in touch with me. You'd tell the funeral director, I would like a humanist ceremony, and your funeral director knows all of the humanist celebrants in the area, and they would get in touch with me. If it was before you had died and you wanted a particular humanist celebrant, or you decided, you could make a note of their name and tell your funeral director, I want this person, and they've got good contacts, they'd be able to find us.
Does anybody actually speak to you before they die? You know?
Yes, we're doing that more and more now. People will get in touch with us, and while they're still alive, they will meet up, and they will tell us the music they want, the poems they want read, and the stories that they want shared. And you write their funeral while they're still alive, and you give it to them, and they decide whether they like it or not. And it tends to be when I personally, not all funeral celebrants do this, but when I write a funeral, I always give it to the family beforehand, and they can have a look at it and check I've understood their stories, and maybe they want to add a few extra once they've seen it, or they've changed their minds. I think maybe someone else reading that or hearing that story won't see it the way we do, and maybe like to take it out.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a really good idea. I remember going to a funeral once where it was a religious one, and the preacher was talking about this person. Let's say, I can't say Susan Marie. He kept talking about Susan Marie. Everybody knew her as Jo, and so it was very grating, you know. But obviously, if you check it out, which sounds a great idea. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about the general approaches to a humanist ceremony. But we're going to have a little break now with your choice of music. What have you chosen for your?
I chose Let's Dance by David Bowie, a song from my childhood.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome back. I'm speaking with Susan Walker from the North East Humanists about humanist funeral ceremonies. Now, we touched a little bit on this, but perhaps you could tell us a bit about some general approaches to funerals that you've experienced or heard about, Susan.
Well, one that's really, really striking is a woman wrote her own funeral beforehand. Not the beginning and end bits where I tend to talk about living on in people's memories. Instead, she wrote the story of her life, and she'd done that before she died. She knew she was going to die, and it was very easy funeral to plan because she'd done it all before, and that was really interesting. Other people have woodland burials, which are they are lovely if the weather's nice.
Yeah.
You have to be prepared. If the weather's not nice, everyone's going to be there in wellies. It's a less formal occasion. But it's a lovely place to go and visit afterwards, I should imagine.
I've read in the papers about some people doing fancy dress or unusual, coffins and things. Is that something which, that you've experienced? Or?
I've personally experienced. We had some reenactors and everyone came dressed and in their reenactment costumes. The coffin was a cardboard one that had been painted up with reenactment scenes and stuff. And there were lots of photographs and things taken of the event, which seems unusual, but I almost would recommend it because you're so grief-struck, it's really hard to lay down memories during a service. Actually, the more you have to remember the service by, the better.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant idea. So you wouldn't mind people getting their camera phones out and taking photographs?
No, I've even been live streamed on, people have Skyped or FaceTimed the ceremony to people who are abroad in other parts of the world.
Oh, gosh, that's brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
I always ask the celebrant and the family. It tends to be the family who organise it, but yes, as long as you ask first.
Oh, brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Are there any restrictions on what you can do in a ceremony?
As long as you don't outrage public decency, there you can do almost everything. A lot of people think humanists won't allow prayers and won't allow religious music. And I'd be lying if I say every humanist would allow that, but most I know, they won't say prayers themselves, but if someone else wants to get up and say a prayer, because the audience will be mixed, some people will be humanists, some people will have a religion. And as for religious songs, a lot of people, they might be atheists or humanists, but culturally they'll belong to a religion. And they might belong to a choir or something. And last week I did a funeral for a lady who was in a choir. We had Jerusalem. She was described as her son described her as a rabid atheist. I don't think I'm giving a lot away there, but Jerusalem was one of her favourite songs, and she sang it in the choir. She loved singing it in the choir, so we had it at her funeral. And I know a lot of humanists who have a religious song that has a meaning to them for some other reason, and so they would like it at their funeral.
There was a funeral of a friend recently, and that featured him singing, a recording of him singing, which was very poignant.
Yes, I've had that, and it's not a dry eye in the house normally.
Yes. And just to broaden out what a humanist does, obviously end-of-life planning is the focus, but you did touch that there are other major life events which a humanist would get involved in, like namings,
baby namings, or sort of toddler namings. We welcome new people into the community. I'm particularly taken with the naming ceremonies because parents and guide parents, they're not forced to make promises they don't agree with. They can write their own promises to the newborn child, ones they intend to keep, I know my godparents never took me to church or made sure I was brought up a Christian. And most people don't when they do a christening. Some people do, but not all.
Yeah. And marriages?
Marriages, yes, I do marriages. And again, the couples write their own ceremonies, write their own vows. And I love that. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's not legal, which Humanist UK are working on that. So watch this space.
Yeah. The thing that I'm taking from our chat here today, Susan, is that if you opt for a humanist ceremony, which more and more people are doing, I believe, is that you have more of what you want in it.
Yes, I think so. Yes, you have the... One of the first things I ask, especially for a funeral, is do you have any ideas how you'd like the ceremony to go? And some people have very specific ideas. They've thought about it. They've got it down to a T, what they want and what order they want everything in. Other people like to be guided through. They don't have an idea and they're grief-struck and they just tell me what to say, tell me what to do.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm certainly putting my name down for one, but not for some time, I hope. Yeah. Well, Susan, that's been very interesting. Thank you very much for coming along and sharing with us what you do in your work as a humanist.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.